The camera was a Browning Strikeforce HD Pro, mounted on a white oak at the edge of the tree line, pointed at the brush pile and the wallow behind it. I know the exact model because I pulled the box out of the trash to check the specs the morning after, because I needed something solid to hold on to. The footage was already on my laptop by then. I had watched it 4 times in a row and I still could not put a name to what I was looking at. My name is Ray Castor. I live on 42 acres in Rusk County, Texas, about 8 miles northeast of Henderson, and I had been running trail cameras on this property for 11 years before that morning. I know what deer look like on a game camera. I know what coyotes look like, and feral hogs, and bobcats, and the neighbors' cattle when they work through the fence. I am not a person who mistakes one thing for another on footage I shot myself. On land, I walk 3 or 4 times a week, 20 yards from my own back door. I want to say that before I say anything else. I want it on record, because what I am about to tell you does not fit inside anything I was raised to believe about the world, and the only way I know how to get through it is to say exactly what I saw, in the order I saw it, and let you decide what to do with it. If you have questions about what Rusk County looks like, it is deep East Texas piney woods. Loblolly pine and sweet gum and white oak, creek drainages running off in every direction, thick understory, thick brush. The kind of country where you can lose a cow in 30 yards of timber and not find her till she comes back on her own. My back property line runs along a seasonal creek called Grainy Branch, and between the back of my yard and that creek is about 200 yards of heavy brush, a couple of big brush piles the previous owner pushed up when he cleared a little pasture that grew back in anyway, and a low wallow that holds water after rain. Whitetails use that wallow. Hogs tear it up in summer. I had 4 cameras back in that strip, and I checked them every week or 10 days. And for 2.5 years, the most unusual thing any of them ever caught was a buck with a drop tine coming through in the early morning. That changed in late September of last year. I want to be exact about the timeline because I have the SD card data and I have been over it more times than I can count. So the dates are not approximate. They are the actual dates off the camera's timestamp. September 9th was the first anomaly. I pulled the card on September 12th, routine check. And when I went through the clips, I found one from 9 nights earlier at 2:17 in the morning that I watched 3 times before I moved to the next one. It was the camera on the north side of the big brush pile, the one I call camera 2. The clip was 41 seconds. Something had walked through the frame, and it had done it slow. The body posture was what stopped me. Coyotes move through low and quick. Deer move through in that delicate stepping way they have. Hogs barrel through like they own the place. This thing came through in a low, wide, rolling gait that I have since come to think of as a kind of lope, but slower, like it was being careful not to make noise, with its back hunched and its shoulders up high and forward. It was big. I have a piece of orange survey tape on a branch 12 feet into the frame, at about 4 feet off the ground, that I put there as a size reference after I noticed deer coming through were getting on the small side. This animal's back cleared that tape by a good foot as it passed, and it moved through in a way I have never seen any animal move through a game camera frame, which is to say, it moved through without ever looking at the camera. Every deer knows where the camera is. They don't always react, but there is always that small flick of the ear, that half pause. This thing came through and looked straight ahead and was gone. I told myself it was a big hog. Rusk County has hogs that will go 250, 300 pounds, and a big boar in the brush at night can carry himself in strange ways on a camera. I put the card back and I told myself that. I checked camera 2 again on September 21st and found 6 new clips from that camera alone. The other 3 cameras had combined maybe 4 clips apiece, and 2 of those were moths. Camera 2 had 6, all from the same 2-hour window between 1:45 and 3:40 in the morning, and all from between September 14th and September 19th. The first 3 clips from those 6 were the same thing as before, the animal moving through, slow and low, from the same direction, toward the wallow. The 4th clip was the one that changed everything. This clip was 2 minutes and 22 seconds long. The camera had triggered and then kept triggering because there was sustained motion in the frame. The animal had stopped at the wallow, and it wasn't moving the way an animal moves when it stops to drink. I am going to describe this as precisely as I can, and I am going to do it without trying to make it sound like something I am comfortable with, because I am not. The animal was facing away from the camera, mostly. Its back was to the lens, and it was low, very low, its hindquarters down toward the ground and its front end elevated slightly, and the posture was not a feeding posture, and it was not a drinking posture. Its sides were moving in a way that was distinct from normal breathing. The motion was rhythmic and effortful. And at one point in the clip, at the 1 minute and 37-second mark, it shifted and turned a quarter, and I got a partial profile, and two things became clear to me at once. The first thing was the shape of the head, long and narrow and set on a neck that sat differently than a dog's neck, more upright, more like a person's in the way the skull balanced on top of it. The ears were up and pointed and set high, and they swiveled once while I watched, separately, one going forward and one going back. The way a dog's ears move, but with more range than any dog I have ever owned. The second thing was the body. The proportions were wrong for a dog, and wrong for a hog, and wrong for a bear. The torso was deep-chested but narrow at the hips, the arms, and I am using that word deliberately because the front limbs articulated at the shoulder in a way that no dogs do were long, and the hands, if that is what they were pressed into the ground with what looked like purpose, not a paw splayed for balance, something held flat and deliberate, and the sides were heaving, not breathing, working. I watched that clip 11 times the first night. I did not sleep. I told my wife Paula what I had found, and I showed it to her, and she watched it twice, and then she said she did not want to watch it again, and she went to bed. And I sat at the table with the laptop until about 4 in the morning, and then I went and stood at the back door with the porch light off and looked out toward the brush. I want to give you the science of why I ruled out the things that should be easy to rule out, because I have read enough posts and comments to know those are the first things people reach for. Black bear. The American black bear, Ursus americanus, is present in East Texas but barely. The Texas Parks and Wildlife Department confirms a small breeding population in the Big Thicket area, which is primarily Hardin, Tyler, Jasper, and Newton counties. Rusk County is in the northern piney woods, roughly 80 miles from the core of that range. Bear sightings in Rusk are documented but rare, maybe 1 or 2 reported per decade, and they are always a young male dispersing from that southern population. A dispersing bear does not set up a recurring pattern on a game camera. A bear does not hit the same camera 6 times in 6 nights, and the posture in clip 4 was not a bear posture. I have bear footage on file from a lease in Newton County. I have compared them. Bears are round and bulk forward. What I had on camera was angular and deep and carried itself differently at the shoulder. That is not a bear. Mountain lion. Not impossible in Rusk County, and I would have been thrilled with a mountain lion. Felis concolor makes a distinctive silhouette, long tail, small rounded head, fluid movement. The animal on my camera had none of those features. No visible tail in any clip. Head too large and the wrong shape. Movement not fluid, but effortful. Hog. The largest documented feral hog in Texas history was taken in Sabine County, about 30 miles east of me, and it went something close to 500 pounds. A hog that size is a massive animal. But a hog's head shape is unmistakable, the disc nose and the heavy shoulder, and a hog does not turn a partial profile that shows a pointed ear set atop a long skull. A hog does not have arms. I know how that last sentence sounds. I am leaving it there. Between September 21st and October 3rd, I checked camera 2 every 3 days. The pattern held. The animal came through on average every other night, always between midnight and 4 in the morning, always moving toward the wallow from the north, always leaving to the north. Some clips were just transits. Some were longer stays at the wallow. One clip from September 28th showed it sitting. Actually sitting the way a dog sits, hindquarters down, upright on the rear, but the torso was straight up in a way a dog's doesn't go, and the arms were in its lap. I do not have another way to describe that. I have the footage. Those arms were held against the chest, bent at a joint that bends like an elbow, and the hands were together. I am not going to tell you what I thought was happening. I want to get through the timeline first and come back to that. On October 3rd, I moved camera 2. I had been thinking about the angle for 2 weeks, and I did it on a Tuesday afternoon when the weather was clear. I moved it roughly 15 feet east and angled it to get a better view of the wallow, and I added a second camera, camera 5, on the south side of the brush pile, a Bushnell Core no-glow, which runs on completely invisible infrared, so there is no red flash to alert an animal. Both cameras were set to the maximum clip length, which on my Browning is 100 seconds, and both were set to no delay between triggers. The next 9 nights were quiet. 1 clip of a doe on camera 5, 2 deer on camera 2. I started to think the repositioning had pushed it off. On the 9th night after I moved the cameras, October 12th, I got 23 clips across both cameras between 1 in the morning and 4:58. I found this on October 15th when I pulled the cards. I sat in my truck at the end of my own driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. The first group of clips from camera 5 started at 1:03. The animal came in from the north again. Camera 5 caught it coming around the south end of the brush pile, and for the first time I had a clear frontal 3/4 view. Not a full front, it was angled slightly away, but enough. The face was canine. I mean that in the structural sense. Elongated muzzle, wide-set eyes, prominent brow ridge, the general architecture of a dog's face. But the skull above it was domed differently, fuller in the cranium, and the face sat on a neck that rose vertically from shoulders that were broad and set like a person's. Not sloped like a dog's, not humped like a bear's. Squared, the arms hung forward from those shoulders, slightly bent, and when it moved, they swung in the shoulder socket the way a person's arms swing when they walk. It was walking upright, not stumbling upright, the way a bear rears up sometimes to see or to reach something, not transitioning. Walking. Striding, on 2 feet, with a gait that had the same cadence a person's has, heel down, the weight rolling forward, the hips rotating side to side in that counterbalanced way that is specific to habitual bipedal locomotion. I looked that term up because I needed language precise enough to mean exactly what I am saying. It was not bearing weight on its hands. Its hands were free. It was walking to the wallow the way I walk to my truck in the morning. At one point on camera 5, it stopped and turned its head, and I saw the profile fully. The muzzle was long, longer than a shepherd's, with the nose pad at the end distinct and round and dark. The ears were up. The eye, I could only see one. The near one was large and forward-facing, and caught the infrared in a way that threw back a flat gray-white reflection, which is the tapetum lucidum reflection of a canine eye on a no-glow infrared camera. Dogs do that. Coyotes do that. This did that. Then it went to the wallow, and the posture changed. I am going to describe the next 40 minutes of footage across both cameras as carefully as I know how. And I want to say again before I do that, I understand what I am describing is outside anything I was taught is possible. I have not forgotten that, but I have 23 clips and combined footage of 41 minutes, and I know what I watched. At 1:16, it went down onto its side at the wallow, not down onto all fours first. It went down the way a person lies down, bending at the hip, putting one arm down first, rolling. It was on its side in the wet ground at the edge of the wallow with its back to camera 5 and its face partly toward camera 2, and it stayed that way. The breathing was visible, the sides moving. That same effortful rhythm I had seen in clip 4 from September. At 1:44, something happened that triggered both cameras simultaneously. I don't have better language for what I saw. At 1:44 on 2 cameras from different angles. I have watched wildlife give birth before. I have been present for calves, for kittens, for puppies, for a doe that went down in my back pasture one February morning. I know what that process looks like, and I know that it is a vulnerable moment, and that animals choose their places for it carefully, and that the places they choose are sheltered and secluded, and have usually been prepared. The wallow behind my brush pile in the dark, in the wet clay at the edge of the water, on a Tuesday night in October in Rusk County, Texas, is the place this animal chose. The clips between 144 and 258 are the ones I will not describe in full because I am not sure I could finish this account if I tried. What I will say is that by 258, there was more than one animal at the wallow, and the second one was smaller. And the mother, I am going to say that 58 because that is what was accurate. The mother was upright, on her knees in the mud, and she was doing something with her hands at the wallow's edge. And the way she moved her hands was deliberate, purposeful, intentional in a way that I am still not able to sit with comfortably. There were sounds on the audio track. Both Browning cameras have microphone capability. The sounds were low, below what I could make out clearly, a kind of resonant vocalization that had pattern to it, rhythmic, almost like the sound you make to a dog or to an infant, a repeated low sound, and it came from the mother. The smaller animal made a sound once, a single higher note, and the mother answered it. I went back and counted, watching those clips again. That exchange happened 11 times in the roughly 90 minutes of footage. Same pattern every time. Smaller animal, one note. Mother, one answer. Consistent, repeatable, like a call and response, like a word. At 3:12, camera 2 triggered on something that was not at the wallow. The camera had been catching the wallow scene at the upper left of its frame because of the angle I had set it at. At 3:12, it triggered because something moved in the center of the frame, closer to the camera, in the brush between the camera and the wallow. And it was different from the animal at the wallow, bigger, much bigger. It came through the brush in that low, rolling gait I had seen in the September clips, and it did not go to the wallow. It stopped in the brush, 20, maybe 25 yards from the camera, and it was facing the camera, and I could see the outline of it in the infrared. The male, and again I am going to use the word that fits, was considerably larger than the female at the wallow. The shoulder height in the brush was hard to judge, but I had the orange survey tape in frame, and the top of the animal's head cleared it by what I estimated at 2 feet. That tape is at 4 feet. I am not going to tell you that I am certain of that measurement. I am telling you it was my best estimate from what I could see in the frame. It stood in the brush and it did not move for 6 minutes, which I know because the camera triggered every 20 seconds on sustained motion, and I counted the clips. 6 minutes. Standing, facing the camera, not moving. Facing the wallow. Actually, the camera was just between it and the wallow, so it was looking past the camera toward the female and the newborn. And then, at 3:18, it turned its head, and it looked directly at the camera. I want to be careful here about what I mean by that, because on a game camera, animals look at the camera all the time without knowing it is there. They are looking at the tree, or reacting to a sound, or tracking a scent. Looking at the camera is not the same as seeing the camera. This was not that. It turned its head from the direction of the wallow, straight toward the lens, and it held that position. And after a moment, the clip is clear, it took one step forward, not toward the wallow, toward the camera. One step, measured, and it stopped, and it looked at the lens, and the eyes in the infrared were 2 flat white-gray coins, wide-set, forward-facing, looking at the camera the way you look at something you are deciding what to do about. The clip ended. The camera triggered again, 4 seconds later. The brush was empty. Camera 5 triggered at 3:19 on movement at the north edge of its frame. Gone. I pulled the cards on October 15th. I drove to the property and I sat in the truck at the end of the driveway for 20 minutes, as I said. Then I went inside and I told Paula what was on the cards, and she listened, and she said 2 things. She said, first, that she thought we should call someone. I asked her who, and she could not answer that, and neither could I. She said, second, that she was not going to the back of the property anymore, and that she wanted the cameras moved or taken in, and I understood that completely. I did not take the cameras in. I want to be honest about that. I moved camera 2 back to its original position, and I left camera 5 where it was, and I want to explain why, because it is not a simple answer. Part of it is that I needed to know. That is not a good enough reason, and I know it, but it is a true one. 11 years of running cameras on that property, and what was back there had not been back there for 11 years, or if it had, I had never caught it, and now I had footage of something that I had no category for. And the part of me that has always needed to understand things could not walk away from it. That is my character, and it is not always a virtue. But the other part, the part I think about more now, is that I did not believe the cameras were what was keeping it there. It had been using that wallow before I ever moved camera 2 into position to catch it. It had been here before the cameras. The cameras were not the thing that had brought it to that brush pile in the dark, and taking them away was not going to change whatever had brought it there. All it was going to do was leave me without a record. Between October 15th and October 28th, I checked the cameras every 3 days. The footage from those checks was quiet. Movement, some deer, a coyote once, but nothing on the cameras. That was the thing I was looking for. I told myself it had moved on. I told myself the birth, if that is what it was, had been the reason it was there, and the reason was gone. I started sleeping through the night again. On October 28th, I pulled the cards and found 2 clips on camera, 5 from October 22nd, that I want to describe as carefully as I described everything before. The first clip was 41 seconds, and it was of the female. She came in from the north, same as always, but she did not go to the wallow. She went to the base of the white oak that camera 2 was mounted on. She stood there for a moment and she put her hand, I am going to keep saying that, she put her hand against the bark and she held it there, and she looked up at the camera. The second clip, which triggered 8 seconds after the first one ended, was the female walking north, back the way she came, with the smaller animal at her side. The smaller animal was on 2 legs, walking, upright, beside the mother, and it came up to somewhere between the mother's hip and her waist. I have shared that footage with 3 people. One is a retired wildlife biologist who taught at Stephen F. Austin State University in Nacogdoches for 21 years. He asked me 3 times what I had doctored in the clip, and I told him each time that I had not touched it, and on the 3rd time he said he believed me and that he did not know what he was looking at, and that he did not want his name attached to anything I did with the footage. The second person is a man in Nacogdoches County, a name I got through a small network of people in East Texas who have had experiences they could not account for, and he drove out and walked the property with me and stood at the wallow for a long time without saying anything, and then said, quiet, that he had known it was in this end of the county for about 4 years. He said there was a creek drainage that ran from the National Forest land in Shelby County, down through San Augustine County, and into the northern part of Rusk County, and that he had found tracks and other sign along that drainage since about 4 years back. He said the drainage was about 3 miles from my back property line, which put it moving from that direction. He said he did not know what to do about it, and neither did I, and we left it at that. The third person is Paula, who watched the October 22nd clips once and then went to her sister's house in Longview for 4 days. I want to talk about what it means that it touched the camera tree. I have thought about this for months. The female came in on October 22nd, bypassed the wallow, walked to the tree where camera 2 was mounted, put her hand on the bark, and looked up at the lens. She did not touch the camera. She did not knock it down or pull it off the mount. She stood at the tree and she looked at the camera, and then she left with the younger one. The male had seen the camera on October 12th. He had taken 1 step toward it, and then he had left. The female, 10 days later, came to the tree. I have a trail cam that runs on cell service, a Stealth Cam Fusion that I use on a deer lease in Panola County. That camera sends me a photo to my phone within 30 seconds of it triggering. I am telling you this because people sometimes ask if the cameras communicate somehow, if the animal could have detected a signal. The Browning Strike Force and the Bushnell core I had at the wallow do not transmit anything. They write to an SD card. There is no signal. There is no reason for an animal to connect that camera to the person who set it up. And yet she came to the tree, and she looked at the lens, and she took the younger one, and she walked away. I went back to the wallow on a Thursday afternoon in early November, in daylight, with Paula's brother Mark, who is a big man and not easily unsettled. We went to the wallow and I showed him the physical evidence. The ground at the wallow had been disturbed substantially. The clay was worked up, and there were areas where the soft ground had been pressed flat in ways that were consistent with the shape of a large body having been there. There were two distinct sets of tracks in the clay at the edge of the water. The larger set I measured with a tape. The track itself, the print in the clay, was 14¼ inches long and 8 inches across at the widest point, across what I am going to call the ball of the foot. And the toes, 4 of them, I could distinguish 4 were clearly articulated, with claw marks at the tip of each that measured out from the toe a little over an inch. The stride between tracks, measured heel to heel, was 61 inches. That is 5 feet and 1 inch of ground between footfalls on a walking animal. The smaller set of tracks measured 8 inches long. The stride was 22 inches. Those are the proportions of a young animal, not fully grown, learning to carry itself. Mark stood at the wallow and did not say anything for a while. Then he said that if those were bear tracks, they were the biggest bear tracks he had ever seen and that he had seen a few. I told him they were not bear tracks, and he looked at them a while longer, and he said he knew that. He said he knew that when he looked at the stride on the big ones, because a bear walking does not have a 59-inch stride. He is right. A large black bear in a normal walking gait hits roughly 20 to 24 inches. 61 inches is a running stride for most animals. We did not find the smaller animal's trail crossing in and out at the north end. There were 2 tracks at the wallow's edge, and then nothing. Mark pointed this out. I had no answer for it. I have the photographs of those tracks. I have them on my phone and I have backups on a drive. I am not going to post them publicly right now, and I want to explain why, because I think it is a fair question. The answer is that I live on this property. Paula lives on this property. The wallow is 200 yards from my back door. Whatever is in that creek drainage between here and the National Forest in Shelby County has a younger animal with it now, and it knows where my cameras are, and I do not want to do anything that draws more attention to this specific location while I am still living in it. I want to address the question of whether this animal was dangerous. Not because I know the answer, but because it is the question I have been asked most often by the people I have told. It was in my back brush for at minimum 6 weeks before the October 12th footage. If it was going to harm us, it had time. It did not come past the brush pile. It did not approach the house. It used the wallow and it left, night after night. And even on the night of October 12th, when the male saw the camera and took a step toward it, he stopped and he left. The female came back on October 22nd and put her hand on the tree and she left. I do not take that as comfort. I take it as information. It is choosing not to come closer. That is a choice. A choice implies that it is capable of making one, which is a thing I am still getting used to. What I can tell you about dangerous versus not dangerous is this. I installed a motion-activated light system on the back of the house in late October. 4 Lithonia Lighting OFL LED fixtures on photocell timers, covering the whole backyard out to about 60 feet. I bought a steel security door for the back entry. I told my neighbor to the north, a man named Curtis Bledsoe who runs cattle on about 300 acres, that I had had some animal activity in the back brush that I couldn't account for, and that he might want to keep an eye on his calves near the creek side of his property. I did not tell him what I had on camera. Curtis is a practical man, and he thanked me, and he did not ask questions, which tells me something about the country and the people who live in it. I have not found fresh sign at the wallow since mid-November. The cameras have been quiet. In the way that a man who runs cameras in the same country for over a decade develops a feel for a piece of ground, my feeling is that it has moved on, down the drainage toward the south or back north into the National Forest timber. Either way, the wallow has not been used in 2 months, and the brush pile sits quiet, and the deer have started coming back to the east end of the property, the way they do when there is nothing back there pressuring them. I want to talk about what the network of people in this part of East Texas know about that drainage, because I think it is important, and because I said I would be precise. The man from Nacogdoches County, whose name I am keeping private at his direct request, has documented sign along a creek system that connects through bottomland timber from the Sabine National Forest near the Shelby-Sabine County line, south and west through San Augustine County, into the northern portion of Rusk County, near a series of drainages that feed Caney Branch. My property sits at the western end of that route. He has been tracking this for 4 years, as I said, and he has found tracks on 4 occasions and other sign more frequently, and he has never seen the animal directly. 4 years of documented sign along a corridor that is roughly 30 miles long. That is a home range. 30 miles of creek corridor is within the documented home range of large apex predators. A mountain lion's home range in Texas, male, runs between 100 and 300 square miles, depending on prey, availability, and terrain. The documented corridor this man has been tracking is a fraction of that. That is not a wandering animal. That is an animal that knows this country. I have to talk about the sound, because I left it out, and I think it belongs here. The first time I heard it was in late September, which would have been within the window of the first footage, and I did not connect it at the time. I was outside past midnight, a habit I have had for years, just standing on the back porch in the dark, listening to the property the way you do when you know a piece of ground well enough that you can hear when something is off. It was a still night, which we get in September in East Texas before the fronts start coming, and I was about to go in when I heard it from the direction of the brush. It was a vocalization. I want to use that word and not the word howl, because it was not a coyote howl and it was not a dog's howl, and it bore the closest resemblance, structurally, to a coyote's howl in the way a coyote's howl bears a resemblance to a dog's. It had the same building quality, the same upward slide. But the register was lower than any coyote I have ever heard, lower than a dog's howl, a sound that you felt in the chest cavity as much as you heard it, and it carried for a long time without fading, and at the top of it, just before it came back down, there was something in the sound that I can only describe as intentional, a quality that I would use for a human voice making a deliberate sound, not a reflexive one, not a pain sound or a threat sound, something else, something that sounded, if I am being straight with you, like a statement. I heard it 3 times over 6 weeks. Once in September, once in the first week of October, and once in late October after Paula had come back from her sister's. That third time she heard it too, from inside the house, and she came to the back door and stood next to me, and neither of us said anything. And when it was done, she went back inside, and I stood on the porch a while longer, and the night was quiet after. And I listened to the quiet and tried to figure out what I was carrying now that I hadn't been carrying a year ago. I am 53 years old. I have hunted this part of Texas since I was a boy. I have spent probably more cumulative time in East Texas timber than most people spend in any outdoor environment in their lives. I am not a person who runs from things or who is given to seeing what isn't there. I say that not to make myself sound brave, but to make the point that whatever is on that footage, it is not a product of inexperience or suggestion or fear. I saw it because I put cameras up and checked them and sat down with the footage and looked at it. And then I went back and looked again. And I am telling you what I saw. There is a version of this account that I could give you where I wrap it up neatly, where I tell you I took the footage to somebody and they identified it and it turned out to be something I should have recognized, and everyone goes home with their understanding of the world intact. I want to give you that version. I have been wanting to give myself that version for months. The footage is what it is. The tracks in the clay are what they are. The sound I heard on 3 nights in September and October was what it was. I do not have a clean answer, and I am not going to pretend I do, because the thing I owe anyone listening to this is the same thing I owe myself, which is accuracy. That stretch of creek drainage between here and the National Forest in Shelby County is not empty. It has something in it that has been using a creek corridor through 3 counties for at minimum 4 years, that came to the wallow behind my property in September of last year, that chose a spot in my back brush to do something I watched on camera and am still deciding how to carry, that saw the camera and made a decision about it, and that touched the tree the camera was on before it left with the younger animal. And it has not come back. I do not know if it will. I check the cameras. I listen on the porch at night. I walk the back of the property in daylight, and I look at the wallow and the brush pile, and I think about the footage and the tracks and the sound. And I think about the way she put her hand on that bark and looked up at the lens, and I think about what that means. I have not taken the cameras down. I am not sure I ever will. Some part of me understands that whatever is on that drainage already knows exactly where I am, and the cameras are not the variable. I am. I am the one who has to decide what I do with what I know, and I have not finished deciding that yet. What I know is this. 42 acres in Rusk County, Texas, 8 miles northeast of Henderson, off a county road that I have lived on for 16 years. Loblolly pine and sweet gum and creek bottoms and a wallow in the back brush that drains to Caney Branch. And something that used that wallow for its own purpose, on its own schedule, in the dark, and knew it was being watched, and looked at the lens, and left. I am 53 years old, and I have spent my life in these woods. I have never had a reason to be afraid of the dark out here. I am being straight with you when I tell you that is not true anymore. I need to back up now, because I skipped something in the telling, and the thing I skipped matters. When I said the footage from September 9th was the first anomaly, that was the first anomaly on camera. It was not the first anomaly on the property. In late August, 3 weeks before that first clip, I noticed the deer pattern on my 2 front cameras change. I run cameras year-round, not just in hunting season, because I have been managing a small deer herd on this property for going on 9 years, and the camera data is how I track age, structure, and body condition going into fall. In late August, the buck that I had been watching on camera 3, a mature 8-point that I estimated at 5.5 years old based on body characteristics, simply stopped appearing. Not a gradual drop-off. 1 week he was on camera 4 or 5 nights out of 7. The next week, he was gone. Bucks do shift their patterns in late summer, moving to hard mast, but this buck had used the same oak flat on the front of my property every August for 3 years, and I had the footage to prove it. He did not go somewhere else. He stopped coming into this part of the country entirely. I noticed it, filed it in the back of my mind, and moved on. At the time, I thought maybe hunting pressure from the road, or a new corn feeder the guy on the adjacent property put up. I had reasons for it, and they satisfied me, and I kept checking cameras and making notes. But looking back now, and I have spent a lot of time looking back on the August timeline, the buck's pattern changed in the 3rd week of August. The first camera clip of the unknown animal was September 9th. A mature 5.5-year-old whitetail buck in his home range shifted completely off a 3-year established pattern roughly 3 weeks before I first caught something on camera, something that was coming in from the north where his home range extended. That buck did not come back to my front cameras all fall. I saw him twice in December, both times moving fast through a corner of camera 2's frame, headed south. He was not relaxed, and he was not on a feed pattern. He was moving. Mature whitetails, particularly mature bucks, are highly attuned to predator pressure. They abandon areas and shift ranges in response to predators consistently. The research on this is clear, and it has been replicated in studies from the Southeast and the Midwest. Whitetails detect large predator presence through scent and alter movement accordingly, often within days. The buck left the north end of my property in the 3rd week of August. Whatever was in that creek drainage was in that creek drainage before September 9th. I want to add one more piece of the August timeline, and then I am going to tell you about what happened in the brush on the night of November 3rd, which I have left until now because I needed everything else to be on the record first. On August 29th, a Sunday, I was working the fence line along the north edge of my property. That fence runs along the property line between me and the Bledsoe place, through a stretch of mixed hardwood and pine where the creek drainage comes closest to my cleared ground. I was pulling old wire and stapling new, slow work in the heat, and I was about 2/3 of the way down the line when I found the scrape. Not a deer scrape. I know what a deer scrape looks like. This was in a low spot where the ground stayed soft even in August, maybe 8 feet square of bare earth under a cluster of sweet gum, and the ground had been worked. Not dug, not rooted hog's root, and this was not that. The ground had been pressed and turned, the way ground gets when something heavy has been lying in it and moving around. There were leaf fragments pressed into the soil, the way you press paper into wet clay. And at the edge of the disturbed ground, facing north toward the creek, 2 clear impressions in the wet clay. In August, I looked at those 2 impressions for about 30 seconds, and I decided they were from a large dog, maybe something off the Bledsoe place, and I finished the fence and I went home. I have a photograph of them on my phone from that day because I photograph anything unusual when I am working the property. I have looked at that photograph every week since October. Those impressions are not from a dog. The width across the widest point is wider than any domestic dog track I have ever seen, and the claw marks at the toe ends are too long, too widely spread. More importantly, those impressions are the right distance apart and the right orientation to be 2 feet, left and right. A standing animal. I walked right past it in August. I took a photograph of it, and I told myself it was a big dog track, and I went home. I think about that afternoon every time I look at the wallow footage, because what was resting in that soft clay in late August was already here, already using this property's north end, already working its way along that fence line in the drainage, and I had 40 years of familiarity with this country telling me what I was seeing, and the familiarity was wrong. That is the thing I keep coming back to. Not the footage, not the tracks at the wallow, not the sound. The thing I keep coming back to is the August photograph on my phone, which I took myself on a Sunday afternoon in my own fence line, of something I told myself was a big dog, and I was wrong. And the wrongness was right there in my own hand for 6 weeks before I understood it. Now, I need to tell you about November 3rd. I had been checking the cameras every 3 days since October 15th. The 2 clips from October 22nd, the female at the camera tree and then the female and the younger one leaving, were the last footage I had of them. The cameras were quiet the rest of October. As I said, I started to think they had moved on down the drainage. On November 2nd, I checked the cameras and found nothing. November 3rd was a Friday. I had been at a school board meeting in Henderson until about 9:30, and I got home around 10, and Paula was already in bed. I let the dogs out. We have 2 dogs, a lab mix named Hatch and an older beagle named June, both house dogs, and I stood on the back porch while they did their business in the yard. Hatch went to the yard's edge, the boundary where the mowed grass meets the brush, and he stopped. He did not go into the brush. He stood at the edge and he put his nose up and worked the air, and his tail went from wagging to dead still in about 2 seconds, and he turned and he came back to the porch without finishing, which he has never done. Hatch is 8 years old and he is not a nervous dog. He will tree a squirrel and bark at it until I come drag him inside. He does not abort his business and come back to the porch. June did not leave the porch. I stood there watching the brush line for a few minutes, and I heard nothing and saw nothing, and I told the dogs to go inside, and they went fast. And I stood on the porch alone for maybe another 5 minutes. Nothing. The motion lights I had installed did not trigger. The brush was still. The only sound was the usual night sounds. Insects. A truck a long way off on the county road. I went inside and I got my flashlight. Not the little one. The Surefire I keep in the truck for roadside situations. It throws about 800 lumens and it reaches out to the range I needed. I went back out on the porch and I shone it down the backyard and into the brush. The eyes were at the brush line. I am going to tell you exactly what I saw. 2 eyes at the brush line, at the height of about 4 feet off the ground when they first caught the light. Canine tapetum reflection. That flat silver-gray color, wide set and forward-facing. About 4 feet up, and as I held the light on them, they rose. Smoothly and without rushing, they came up off the 4-foot level to the 5-foot level to where I estimated 6 feet, and held there. Something had been crouched or sitting at the edge of the brush, and it had stood up, and it took maybe 3 seconds to do it, and it stood, and it looked at my light. I did not run. I want to be clear about that, not because I am proud of it, but because it is relevant to what happened next. I held the light on it, and I stood on my porch and I did not move. The eyes held. I could see the rough outline of the animal in the edge of the flashlight throw, the dark shape of it, larger than it needed to be. The shoulders squared and high the way they had looked on camera, but I could not see detail at that distance in that light. We stood there like that, me on the porch with the flashlight and the animal at the brush line, for something that my memory says was about 2 minutes, but was probably closer to 45 seconds. Then it turned. Not quickly. It turned the way you turn when you have decided to leave somewhere, and it went into the brush, and the eyes dropped as it went deeper in, and they were gone. I did not hear it go. That is the part that I keep telling people about and that I think gets undersold in how strange it is. It was a large animal. I had seen it on camera, and I had seen its tracks, and I knew the size of what I was dealing with. And it walked into dry November brush, and I did not hear it go. There was no branch snap, no leaf crunch, no rustling. It was simply there and then it was not, and the brush at the back of my yard was still. I pulled the cards the next morning at first light. Camera 5 had one clip, time-stamped at 9:53 that evening, before I got home from Henderson. The animal was at the wallow, alone, the female from the posture and the size. She was sitting at the wallow's edge and she had one hand in the water, a slow back-and-forth motion, and she was looking north. She sat that way for the full 100-second clip, and the camera triggered a second time, and by the second clip, she was standing and facing toward the house. I had been home for about 4 minutes when she looked toward my house from the wallow. Hatch had already pulled up at the brush line and come back to the porch. She knew I was there. I'm going to stop on that for a moment because I need to say it plainly. She was at the wallow at 9:53 in the evening. I got home at 10:02. She was sitting at the wallow with her hand in the water, and she was facing north toward the county road, and when I pulled into my driveway, she stood up and turned toward my house. A wallow that is 200 yards from my back door, through heavy brush, on a night with no wind to speak of, and she stood up and faced toward my house within 4 minutes of my arrival. I have had deer that knew this property better than I did, deer that I watched on camera for years, and never once bumped, even when I was walking 30 yards from them in the brush. That is not the same thing as what I am describing. Deer know a property. What I am describing is something that knew me. That knew my schedule well enough that my truck coming up the county road at 10 in the evening was a meaningful piece of information worth orienting toward. That is the thing I need people to understand about what this was. Not the size, not the footage, as remarkable as that footage is. The thing I need people to understand is that it had been watching this property long enough and carefully enough that it knew the patterns. It knew the cameras were on the white oak and the brush pile post. It knew which direction the house was. It knew that a truck on the county road at 10 in the evening meant I was coming home. That level of environmental awareness, applied to a specific human being's schedule, is not a thing I have a framework for. I talked to Curtis Bledsoe finally in early December, told him enough to tell him. I did not show him the footage. I told him I had documented something in the creek drainage that I could not identify, large, bipedal in at least some of its movement, and that it had been using the drainage regularly for at minimum 6 weeks that I knew of, and probably longer. I told him I had found tracks at my wallow, and I described the measurements. I told him I had heard vocalizations, and that I had physically seen it at my brush line at night. Curtis is 68 years old. He was born in Rusk County and has never lived anywhere else. He listened to all of it, and then he was quiet for a while. And then he said that his grandfather had told him when he was a boy that there was something in the creek drainages in this part of the county that the old-timers did not have a name for in English, that they called it by a name in a language Curtis did not speak, which was the language of the Caddo people who had been in this part of East Texas long before the first Anglo settlers came through. His grandfather said the Caddo avoided the creek drainages after dark, and that the avoidance was not superstition but knowledge, the kind of practical knowledge that people who live close to the land pass down, because not passing it down costs lives. He said his grandfather had said this one time and never brought it up again, the way people talk about things they want to deposit somewhere outside themselves and then leave alone. Curtis said he himself had never seen anything in the drainage he could not account for. But he said that his cattle avoided that creekside fence line in the hours before dawn, which he had always taken for something in the laurel, coyotes or a lion. But now that I had mentioned it, had been going on for a couple of years. He said his calves were fine, nothing had been taken. But his cows knew to stay off that fence line in the dark. I asked Curtis what he wanted to do about it. He said, and I think about this answer a lot, that he did not think there was anything to do about it. He said it had been in that drainage before either of us was born, and probably before his grandfather was born, and that whatever it was, it seemed to understand where the line was, and that the best he could offer was to make sure his dog stayed inside at night for the time being, which he had already started doing. He asked me how Paula was handling it. I told him she was managing. He nodded, and he said to tell her he was sorry she was in the middle of it, and he went back to his truck. That conversation was December 6th. I have not had another sighting since November 3rd, and the cameras have been quiet since October 22nd, which I said earlier. The winter has been quiet. The wallow looks like any other patch of wet clay in the back brush. The deer are back on the front of the property, and the buck I lost in August showed up on camera 3 in late January, working through on the edge of the property. Not comfortable, but there. I am going to tell you what I have concluded, for whatever it is worth, and I am going to be precise about what is conclusion and what is fact, because that line matters to me. Fact. I have trail camera footage showing a large, bipedal, canine-featured animal using a wallow on my property over a period of at minimum 6 weeks in the fall of last year. Fact. That footage includes what the body posture, duration, and behavioral indicators suggest was a birth event, or the immediate aftermath of one, at the wallow on the night of October 12th into the early hours of October 13th. Fact. Tracks in the clay at the wallow measured 14¼ inches in length with a 61-inch stride, and a secondary set measuring 8 inches in length with a 22-inch stride, both in the pattern of bipedal locomotion. Fact. A male animal, substantially larger than the female, observed the camera directly, took a measured step toward it, and left. Fact. The female animal subsequently visited the camera tree, placed her hand on the bark below the camera, and looked at the lens. Fact. On November 3rd, I observed the animal directly with a flashlight at the edge of my back brush, and it stood and looked at me for approximately 45 seconds before leaving without sound. Fact. The female was at the wallow on the night of November 3rd and turned to face my house within 4 minutes of my arrival home, indicating an awareness of my schedule and presence that goes beyond normal animal environmental sensitivity. That is the factual record. What I conclude from it is something I am going to offer carefully because I do not want to claim more certainty than I have. I conclude that what was on this property was not an animal in any category I was taught exists in East Texas or anywhere in North America. The size, the locomotion, the behavioral evidence of deliberate environmental awareness, the apparent social structure of a male and female pair with at least one offspring, the vocal behavior, the apparent investigative response to the cameras, none of those things, individually or together, fit any documented species. I am not saying that as hyperbole. I am saying it as a statement of fact, arrived at by a 53-year-old man who has spent his life outdoors in this part of Texas and who knows the difference between what he knows and what he doesn't. I conclude that the creek drainage from the Sabine National Forest through San Augustine County into northern Rusk County is a travel corridor that this animal, or these animals, use on a regular basis. I conclude, based on the track record of the man from Nacogdoches County and the patterns he has documented over 4 years, that this corridor has been in use for at minimum that long, and likely much longer. Curtis Bledsoe's cattle have been avoiding that fence line for a couple of years. His grandfather knew enough to mention it as inherited knowledge. The Caddo people who lived in these creek drainages before any of us had a name for what was in them that warranted being passed down. I conclude that it is not gone, that it is down the drainage in the National Forest timber, or working through the creek bottoms in San Augustine County, or somewhere in the 50 or 100 or 200 miles of creek corridor and bottomland hardwood that runs through deep East Texas, that it moves and it comes back, that it has been doing this long enough that it has a rhythm, and the rhythm includes this end of Rusk County and Caney Branch, and the wallow behind my brush pile. I concluded a while back that I do not want to be here at night alone anymore, and then I found myself doing it anyway, standing on the porch in the dark with the flashlight, checking the cameras before first light, Walking the fence line on Tuesday afternoons. I do not have a good explanation for that. Some version of needing to keep eyes on a thing you cannot stop thinking about. Some version of the same instinct that made me leave the cameras up after Paula asked me to take them down. I need to know what is in that timber. I need to know if it comes back. I need the record to be current and complete. What I know about the wallow is that it is a good wallow. It holds water after rain. It is sheltered on the north and east by the brush pile. The timber comes down close on 3 sides, and there is an open approach from the south, which is toward the house, which means anything at the wallow can see what is coming from that direction. It was not an accidental choice. It was a good location selected by an animal that understood the advantages of that location, and the fact that my property happened to contain that location was, from the animal's perspective, probably not a consideration at all. We were here and it moved through, and then it stayed because that wallow met its needs during a specific and critical event, and it left when the event was over, and the property was a piece of geography to it, the same way. 40 miles of creek drainage is a piece of geography to it. My fence lines and my deed and the fact that I pay property taxes on this ground were not part of its calculation. I think about that a lot. The 42 acres I have put 16 years into, the cameras and the food plots and the fence work, the hours I have walked this property in every season, and from where that animal stands, all of that is just timber and brush and a wallow that holds water. My house is a structure in a clearing 200 yards from the water. I am a thing that comes and goes on a schedule that can be learned, and it learned it. I am going to stay on this property. I want to say that clearly because I think some people are waiting for me to say I left. The way Harold Ross's man said most people who see it close move away. I am not moving. This is my land, and it was here before I was, and I expect it will be here after I am gone. And I have worked this ground too long to let something I can't name push me off it. That is stubbornness more than bravery, and I know the difference. But I check the cameras now every 2 days instead of every 10. I installed a 3rd camera at the north fence line, pointed down the drainage corridor, in early December. I do not go to the back of the property after dark alone. I keep the Surefire on the table by the back door. I listen differently now when I stand on the porch at night, with a specificity I did not have before September. Listening not for the presence of sound, but for its absence, for the places where the crickets stop and the night goes flat and close, and the only thing you can hear is your own heart working. On clear nights in East Texas, the sky is enormous. You can stand in the backyard and see more stars than most people see in a year. The Milky Way, a wash of light overhead, the timber, a black wall on 3 sides. I have stood out there my whole life and felt the rightness of it, the sense of being a small thing in a large place that is working exactly as it is supposed to. I still feel that. But there is a difference now. There is a place in that feeling that did not used to be there, a small, cold place, the way you feel a draft in a room you thought was sealed. The woods are large, and most of what is in them I know, and most of what I know is not a threat. But some of what is in them I do not know, and I know that now, in a way, I did not know it before last September, and that knowledge does not go away when I go inside and lock the steel door and turn off the back porch light. It stays with you. That is what I want people to understand more than anything else, more than the footage and the tracks and the timeline. It stays with you, not as fear exactly, or not only as fear, as a change in your understanding of what the timber contains, as the permanent addition of a variable that was always there, but that you did not have the information to account for. You go through your life with a set of things you believe to be true about the world you live in, and most of those things are correct, and most of them will never be challenged, and then one of them is challenged, by footage you shot yourself on a camera you paid for and property you own, and it does not go back to being unchallenged. The knowledge is there and you carry it, and the creek drainage 3 miles east carries it too. In the brush and the bottomland timber, in whatever moves through that corridor on a schedule that includes coming back to a clay-bottom wallow in the backbrush of a 42-acre property in Rusk County, Texas, it will come back. I believe that in the way I believe things about land I know well. Not from evidence I can show you, but from the feel of it, the way a piece of ground feels when it is in regular use, and the way it feels when it is resting, and this ground still feels in regular use. The cameras will tell me when. The footage will be what it will be, and I will still be here, checking the cards before first light, standing on the porch in the dark, listening for the places where the sound goes out. That brush pile is still back there, 200 yards from my door, in the dark, in the timber, at the edge of a wallow that holds water after rain. Empty as far as I know tonight. Empty as far as I have known for 2 months. But I said the same thing in August. And I was wrong. If you have seen something in this part of East Texas, in these creek drainages, in the national forest timber, or the county road cuts at night, I want to know. Not because I am looking to build a case or prove something to someone who has already decided. Because the man from Nacogdoches County and I are trying to map what we know, and what we know is incomplete, and what fills in the gaps might come from someone listening to this right now, who drove home one night on a Rusk County road and saw something in the headlights that they have been trying to find a way to say out loud ever since. You know who you are. This is Ray Castor, Rusk County, Texas, 8 miles northeast of Henderson. I am still here.